Welcome everybody, this is International Master John Paul Wallace for ChessLecture.com. We've had quite a few requests recently for Endgames, and I'm up to the task here, and we're going to start with Pawn Endgames 101, the very basics. Now, even though we're going to start with the basic ones, we're going to find after a few examples, not likely in today's lecture, but eventually, that pawn endgames are actually horrendously difficult. I was looking at rook endgames today with a student, and what I realized, not for the first time, is that they are just so difficult. And even for masters and grandmasters, the amount of mistakes that happen in both complex pawn endgames and complex rook endgames in particular is really quite remarkable. Especially because there's sometimes not much to rely on in an endgame. What have you got to sort of go off if you can't just read that in an opening book, or you know that you have to put the knight comes out to f3 and the bishop comes out to b5 and we have the Roy Lopez. Endgames are often much trickier than that. On the one hand, they require understanding in a more real way than just rattling off openings. But in another sense, they also require very concrete calculation. And sometimes it feels impossible to calculate an endgame right until the very end. Whereas in a middle game, you might have a situation where, with a bit of hard work, you can calculate the force win right to the end, or you realize that you just get a massive attack in one particular variation. In an endgame, it's not that simple, and sometimes the fewer pieces on the board, the more difficult it is. Now, if we take a look at the position on the board, we have basically the most simple pawn endgame that exists. White's a pawn up, his pawn's going up the board, and he wants to promote on e8. Now, as a coach, I'm no longer surprised when I give this position to quite a strong player. We're talking about 1500 ELO rating, FIDE rating. It's probably even higher in American rating. That might equate to, say, 1600, 1650, and they don't even know this position. And not only have they not studied it before, but when I play it against them, and they have to defend as black, they just lose constantly. They don't even know, they're not even sure whether it's a win or a draw. And if you've never seen it before, that's definitely not immediately obvious. So even strong players struggle with this, but this is really pawn endgame 101. So let's take a look. Now, there's one more feature I'd like to point out in this position that we're going to see by the end of the lesson. This is very important. Is the placement of the king. The white king is what matters. Black obviously has to blockade with his king, so that's sort of less relevant. But the white king is side by side the pawn, or another way of looking at it is it's not in front of the pawn. Now, if we have a situation where the white king was in front of the pawn, black's sometimes drawing, but very often losing, and we'll have a look at when it's a loss and when it's a win later on in the lecture. But if we have a situation where the white king is not further up the board than the white pawn, in this case, it's both on the third rank. If we went up, if the king was here and the pawn was here, in other words, both on the fourth rank, it would be the same thing. We have a situation where the king is on the same line as the pawn and not further up. It's always a draw. Now let's take a look why. White to move pushes the pawn. Black is forced backwards. Now, black's task is to stop the pawn reaching e8. So he's got three possible moves to choose from. At the moment, it's not going to make any difference, except king f4, which is quite a ridiculous move anyway. It's counterintuitive as it is, and not surprisingly, after king d4, black's going to lose. Basically now, the king is allowed to get in front of the pawn, or another way of looking at it is black is not blocking the pawn, and the king and pawn will be able to help each other up the board step by step.